It was a dreadful time for Israel. It all began about 60 or 70 years earlier. Apart from some notable lapses, King David had been a noble and godly leader of the nation. But his son Solomon, for all his wisdom, embarked upon a rapid downward spiral into idol worship. He was, nonetheless, still the king. And as king, he recognized the need for some civil engineering work to repair and strengthen the defense systems around Jerusalem. One of the foremen leading the construction was a man called Jeroboam from the tribe of Ephraim. One day, Jeroboam was walking down Jerusalem Street when a wild-eyed man approached him, and Jeroboam watched in amazement as the man removed his new cloak and proceeded to rip it into pieces. As Jeroboam paused to see where this could possibly be leading, the man threw the 12 torn pieces on the ground between the two men and began to address Jeroboam. And here's what he said, and I'm reading from the Message, the paraphrase by Eugene Peterson. "Take 10 of these pieces for yourself. This is by order of the God of Israel. See what I'm doing. I'm ripping the kingdom out of Solomon's hands and giving you 10 of the tribes in honor of my servant David and out of respect for Jerusalem, the city I especially chose. He will get 1 tribe. And here's the reason. He faithlessly abandoned me and went off worshipping Ashtoreth, goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, god of the Moabites, and Molech, god of the Ammonites. He hasn't lived the way I have shown him, hasn't done what I had wanted, and hasn't followed directions or obeyed orders as his father David did." The wild-eyed man, also known as Ahijah, the prophet, Ahijah, went on to inform the amazed Jeroboam that he was to be the new king of Israel. He, Jeroboam, was to be the new king of Israel, apart from 2 tribes, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. All he had to remember was that he would be successful to the degree that he followed in the way of King David and avoided the many pitfalls into which Solomon had fallen, or rather, into which he had jumped. When news of this turn of events reached Solomon, he was none too happy to learn that he was going to lose his throne and ordered the assassination of Jeroboam. Jeroboam promptly fled to Egypt. This is a history lesson so far. Eventually, Solomon died, and his son Rehoboam inherited the throne. Jeroboam returned to Jerusalem, and to cut a long story short, Ahijah's prophecy came true, and he became the king of Israel, or the northern kingdom. Okay. You can read the full story of this in 1 Kings chapter 12, which is not even the chapter we're looking at today, but on here you'll see the green part is Israel, and the yellow part here is Judah. Israel is, for reasons you can probably guess, referred to as the northern kingdom. And Judah is known as the southern kingdom. Okay. Now, you would have thought that since Jeroboam saw exactly what happened to Solomon, he would have been very careful not to follow in his steps. In fact, Ahijah was quite specific in telling him to follow the example of David, not the example of Solomon. But no. Even though Jeroboam knew full well that he was God's choice to be king, he thought he had to manipulate events to solidify his position. In a minute, we'll see exactly what Jeroboam did to protect his position, and it was shocking. But first we should ask, why? Why did Jeroboam feel it necessary to take things into his own hands? He had been given a clear mandate from God through his prophet, and the promise made was confirmed by the unfolding events. Think back a bit. How did Jeroboam feel when Solomon put a price on his head? We pretty much know how he felt from his actions. He fled. But things were different now. The promise made by Ahijah did seem unlikely when it was made, but circumstances had shown that the promise was real. It had been fulfilled. Somewhat remarkably, Jeroboam was indeed the king of Israel. God made him a promise, and now that promise was being fulfilled. So what excuse was there for his unbelief? There was no excuse. But even so, he wanted to do things his own way instead of following God's way. And once he got started down that road, things got really bad. He was following Solomon's path instead of David's. Remember, though, that before Solomon fell into idolatry, he said some very wise things. And they recorded many of them in the book of Proverbs. And here's one that he said: "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths." Now, what does that word acknowledge in Proverbs 3 really mean? Or if you have the NIV, it will say not acknowledge, it will say submit to. If you submit to God, he will make your paths straight, is the NIV. But what is the verse really saying? The word translated acknowledge or submit to is the Hebrew word yada. I may not have pronounced that right, but as probably a few of you know how to pronounce it, I'm going to go with yada. And Pastor, who actually does know, is nodding, so I'm on the right track. It appears roughly 1,000 times in the Old Testament. Often it is translated no. Adam and Eve knew that they were naked. Noah knew that the waters were abated. Joseph made himself known to his brothers. But sometimes it is used to indicate the same thing, but with a rather deeper inflection. He was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And in Isaiah chapter 6, God says to Isaiah, "Go and tell this people, be ever hearing but never understanding, be ever seeing but never perceiving." Same word, yada. So what Solomon was saying was, in all your ways, know God. Become acquainted with God. Perceive God's ways. When you know God in this way, he will direct you, since you know him well enough to follow, no matter how counterintuitive that may seem. And that was Jeroboam's problem. He had never become acquainted with God to know his ways. And those natural abilities that were recognized by Solomon so that he promoted him to the position of foreman during the construction project were all that Jeroboam relied on. He truly did lean on his own innate understanding, disregarding the willingness of God to lead him. How well do we know God? Are we willing to let him lead us? There is no other way to know his blessing, and we ignore his leading at our peril. There is a strong correlation between knowing God and trusting God. Sometimes we trust a person because they are trained in a particular skill. We trust an airline pilot because he or she has gone through a rigorous training program and appropriate certification. But while we trust him to fly the plane, I doubt that we would trust him to do heart surgery. He wasn't trained for that. And we don't know him. We don't know the pilot of the plane. We may have, as we've got on the plane, peeked into the cockpit and seen him doing pilot stuff in there, but we really don't know him. But other times we trust a person purely because we do know them. I trust Sandy. Implicitly. Not because she has been trained to be the perfect wife. I don't know how she did that. It was without training, I think. I trust her because I know her. Over the past 30-something years, I'll be in trouble for that, I have got to know her so well that I know her love for me is unconditional. She is always true to her word. She always wants the best for me. Knowing that, I always trust you, honey. And so it is with our trust in God. As we get to know him, we become more familiar with who he is. We know that his character is love. His word is always true, and he has a plan for us that will ultimately be very good, even though we may find ourselves in situations we neither understand nor enjoy. We trust him because we know him. But Jeroboam obviously didn't follow Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6. He tried to consolidate his position as king of Israel all on his own. He looked at the map, this map, and he painted an arrow on it that we didn't know about that, but there it is. And he painted it quite well, and the arrow pointed to, and you may not be able to see this if you're sitting at the back. If you were sitting at the front, that would be a lot better. Just saying. That there is Jerusalem. Now you'll notice about the thing about Jerusalem is we said this is the southern kingdom of Judah, the green is the northern kingdom of Israel, and Jerusalem is almost right on the border. And Jeroboam looked at the map and he put that arrow on it. Well, not really, but he looked at the map and he realized there was a danger, and the danger was that the people would want to go to Jerusalem to worship. And if they kept going to Jerusalem to worship, they might even stay over there. In fact, the border between Israel and Judah might be blurred. In fact, he may even lose his position as king because, well, the people would tend to be gravitating down to the southern kingdom all the time, and his position as king would be in jeopardy. If he had been trusting in the Lord with all his heart, he would have acted differently. But no, he leant on his own understanding and devised his own plan. He would set up his own centers of worship right there in the northern kingdom. He would set up one in Bethel. That's the yellow arrow points to Bethel. You probably guessed that. and one all the way up at the north in Dan. This is going to keep his people in his own kingdom. But the very sad and shocking thing was that when Jeroboam set up these two centers of worship, they were centers of idolatry. And he set up an idol of gold in Bethel. Bethel, it means the house of God. At the end of the 12th chapter of 1 Kings, we read this damning summary of Jeroboam's perversion of Israel's spiritual life. Again, from Eugene Peterson's paraphrase. And that wasn't the end of it. Jeroboam built forbidden shrines all over the place and recruited priests from wherever he could find them, regardless of whether they were fit for the job or not. To top it off, he created a holy New Year festival to be held on the 15th day of the 8th month, to replace the one in Judah, complete with worship offered on the altar at Bethel and sacrificing before the calves he had set up there. He staffed Bethel with priests from the local shrines he had made. This was strictly his own idea, to compete with the feast in Judah, and he carried it off with flair, a festival exclusively for Israel, Jeroboam himself leading the worship at the altar. The northern kingdom got off to a terrible start. But worse was yet to come. So I told you it was going to be a history lesson, and I hope you're remembering all these dates and the number of years that the king's reigning, because it will help you when you do the test before we leave this morning. It'll be a multiple choice test. Jeroboam got off to a terrible start, but things continued to get worse. The next king was Jeroboam's son, Nadab. He reigned for 2 years, and until he was killed by Baasha. Baasha turned out to be a really nasty piece of work. I hit the button twice. And he set about destroying Jeroboam's family. He slaughtered every last one of them. He was another evil king, and he reigned for 24 years until his son took over when he died. Elah, Baasha's son. I don't know much about him except that after he had reigned for just 2 years, he was getting drunk along with the captain of the chariot force when a man named Zimri slipped into the house and killed him. He only lasted for 2 years, but he is again described as doing evil in the sight of the Lord. So Zimri became king. Zimri lasted no time at all, just 7 days. He was the object of the rage of the Israel army. They realized that he had assassinated Elah, and so they set about to do him in, and they did. They surrounded him in the palace. And Zimri, realizing he was as good as dead, committed suicide anyway by setting fire to the palace and letting the flames do the job for him. And his reign lasted just 7 days. The next king was Omri. Omri reigned much longer, for 12 years, but he was more evil than all the kings who had preceded him. When he died, he was succeeded by King Ahab. And now we're actually getting to the part of the First Kings I said we were going to get to. Took us a while to get there. Ahab continued the rapid moral decline, and First Kings records that he was more evil even than his father Omri. It is clear that each king from Jeroboam to Ahab led the northern kingdom further and further away from God. Ahab raised the stakes even further by marrying a heathen woman, Jezebel, the daughter of the Sidonian king Ethbaal. At Jezebel's leading, he instituted worship of Baal. He built a temple to Baal close to his palace in Samaria and furnished it with an altar to Baal. Worse yet, he built a shrine to the goddess Asherah, probably to please Jezebel. The worship of Asherah was especially degrading as it involved sexual immorality, prostitution, divination, and fortune-telling. Between them, Ahab and Jezebel were leading Israel down a very rocky road. It is hard to tell who was worse, Ahab for his wicked leadership or Jezebel for introducing the worship of Asherah. The Queen Jezebel had attempted to kill 100 of the prophets of God who were saved only by divine intervention in the form of a loyal Jew named Obadiah. Obadiah worked in the palace and was able to warn the prophets of the danger and hide them until Jezebel moved on to some other form of evil. And then along comes Elijah on a white horse. Well, okay, there was no white horse. But Elijah confronts Ahab, telling him that God's judgment is falling on Israel, and on Ahab in particular, in the form of a drought. His message to Ahab is clear. It's not going to rain until I say so. Not surprisingly, Ahab doesn't react very positively to this message, and God instructs Elijah to flee, which he does. And in the ensuing drought, God miraculously provided sustenance for Elijah for over 2 years. Then, in the 3rd year of the drought, God tells Elijah to go to Ahab and tell him the drought is ending. Ahab doesn't know quite what to say. He hates Elijah, but he wants the drought to be over, and Elijah is the only one who can do that. This gives Elijah the opportunity to attempt to sway Ahab to turn away from both Elijah and the prophets of Baal. He proposes a contest in which both Elijah and the prophets of Baal will prepare an altar for a burnt offering, which would be ignited solely by prayer. If Baal accepts the offering by igniting the fire, he will be accepted as God. But if Elijah's offering is ignited, it will show that Elijah's God is the true God. This chapter is one of my favorite chapters in the whole Bible. It's just a compelling story. The contest begins. To an outsider, the contest seemed hopelessly one-sided. Ahab has assembled a huge company of prophets, 450 prophets of Baal, and Jezebel chips in with 400 prophets of Asherah. It appears that Elijah was basically alone. When he prayed to God later, he bemoaned the fact that he was the only prophet in Israel. He likely had some supporters who stood with him, but if you're counting prophets, it was 850 against 1. Elijah lets the Baal prophets go first. They get the sacrifice ready and they pray to Baal. Nothing happens. They get quite excited, dancing and shouting, then cutting themselves to appease Baal. But still, Nothing. Eventually, it is clear to everyone that nothing is what's going to happen. Then Elijah takes charge. He prepares his sacrifice, and then he seems to suddenly have taken leave of his senses. When the sacrifice is ready, he orders the people to pour copious quantities of water over it. They dig a ditch around the altar, and the ditch becomes full of water. Everything is drenched. Then Elijah calmly prays. And immediately, fire falls from heaven. It consumes the wood, drenched though it was. It burns the sacrifice, and the intense heat even causes the rocks of the altar to crumble. Last week, Sanal pointed out that the things God asks us to do sometimes are hard to understand. Or, as he said, sometimes we have to do stupid things. I would suggest that this would have been such an occasion. Can you imagine Jeroboam doing this? Or any of the succeeding kings of Israel? Would Ahab have done it? Well, not at all. The difference between those kings and Elijah was that Elijah knew God. And when God ordered him to do something that to others would have seemed stupid, he obeyed without hesitation. He knew God. And when God directed him to do something, even something that humanly speaking appeared to be stupid, he was totally confident that it would turn out for the best. When the people saw the power of God, they fell down in worship. In a definitive show of their new understanding of who God was, they massacred the 850 false prophets. Elijah turns to Ahab. I imagine he had a bit of a grin on his face when he said, "You better get out of here quick, Ahab, before the rain makes the road impassable." Ahab is mad because it hasn't rained for 3 years. And Elijah warns him to get going right now. The creek's about to rise, he says. Well, Ahab gets into his chariot. Leaving Elijah standing there, he goes off post-haste before the creek stops him leaving. But God gives Elijah the ability to outrun the chariot, and he gets to Jezreel, which is where they were headed first. But then the unthinkable happens. Ahab tells the evil Jezebel what has happened, and when she hears that her prophets of Asherah were all killed, she vows to get Elijah and sends him a warning that she is going to kill him, and Elijah runs away. He really runs away. He goes from the top of the dotted line all the way down to the bottom of the dotted line, and it may look like it's only about 12 or 24 inches, but it was a lot more in the real life. He went all the way down to Beersheba. That's about as far south as you can go. I mean, he's completely left the northern kingdom, he's gone into Judah, and now he's gone as far as you can go. There isn't anywhere south of Beersheba. And when he gets there, he wanders into the wilderness and he sits down under a tree. It was a broom brush tree. It looks like that. This may not have been the exact tree, just so you know. Sitting there under that tree, he feels sorry for himself. Lord, he says, I'm done. Just take me home. Really? Is this the same Elijah who just faced down 850 false prophets? What happened? If you happened to be wandering through the wilderness near Beersheba and you came to that tree and saw Elijah sitting there feeling so sorry for himself, what would you have said to him? Hey, cheer up. It's not as bad as it looks. Elijah, Romans 8:28 still applies. Where's your faith, man? But none of us is immune from feeling sad, depressed, or down. If we regard those who feel that way as somehow spiritually deficient, then we are doing them a grave injustice. And for Elijah, he was a prime candidate for feeling that way at that time. He would have been physically exhausted from the events of the past few weeks, and he would have been emotionally drained. He needed rest and sustenance, not to be relegated to Christian second class. So, not surprisingly, rest and sustenance is exactly what God provided him. First, he fell into a refreshing, deep sleep. Then he woke up to find an angel there, an angel offering him actual food and drink, not spiritual correction. I listened to a sermon by J. Vernon McGee. The dad would have been really pleased about that, Sheila, when I was thinking about this. And he suggests that this could have been a theophany. A theophany is a physical appearance of Jesus before the incarnation. We can't know for sure that that's true, of course, J. Vernon McGee notwithstanding. But we do know that Jesus cared very much for the physical needs of his disciples. So it's entirely appropriate to think that he would have come to meet Elijah's physical and emotional needs. Elijah was burned out, and he wasn't in some way at fault about this. He had expended a great deal of emotional and physical energy in serving God, and now he was physically and emotionally drained. I fear that sometimes we expect church leaders to expend energy performing their duties as though they have unlimited supplies, and they don't. And like anyone who devotes themselves wholeheartedly and unrelenting to a challenging task, burnout is absolutely a danger for Christian workers. We need to be alert to that and to empathize with those who serve us and their Lord diligently and without reserve. So Elijah is revived and rejuvenated, going for another 40 days on the strength of that sustenance. And he ends up at Mount Horeb. Mount Horeb is another word for Mount Sinai. There he rests in a cave. And as he is sleeping, the Lord wakes him up by speaking to him. So Elijah, what are you doing here in this cave? And Elijah pours out his heart to God. Lord, he says, Israel is in an awful mess. From the time you made Jeroboam king, everything has gone downhill. Jeroboam started by dragging the nation into idolatry, and every king since then has made it much worse. The people have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets. Lord, I'm the only one left, and they're trying to kill me. But God seems to ignore Elijah's complaint. He simply tells him to get out of the cave and stand on the mountain. He says, I am about to pass by. Elijah slowly makes his way out of the cave and waits. Then the wind begins to blow. Perhaps it reminded Elijah of recent events. when he saw that first dark cloud on the horizon. A mighty wind blew up and it blew the clouds in so that the rain would come. And maybe God was in this wind, just as he was in that wind. But no, God wasn't in the wind. The wind got much stronger. It blew at the mountain so hard that some of the rocks broke off, but it was a wind, and God wasn't in it. The wind abated, and then the ground began to shake. It was an earthquake. Was God in the earthquake? No. God wasn't there. And then with a mighty roar, fire appeared. The fire that ignited the sacrifice on Mount Carmel was certainly an indication of the presence of God. But this fire was different. God wasn't in the fire. Elijah was no shrinking violet. From everything we know about him, we can imagine that he would relish the sound and fury of the wind, earthquake, and fire. But God had said he was going to pass by. Where was he? I don't know if Elijah came to this particular spot deliberately or at random, but this was the place where God gave the 10 Commandments to Moses. And when God met with Moses on this very mountain, he had to veil his face when he returned to the people because it shone with the glory of the Lord. Was Elijah expecting a similar experience? Where was this presence of God that he had been promised? And then everything went quiet. And slowly there came a gentle, quiet, blowing sound. The NIV calls it a gentle whisper. The King James, which I like, calls it a still, small voice. And God was in it. And that still, quiet, calm, loving voice repeated the question, Elijah, what are you doing here? And Elijah repeats the same complaint that he did before. Israel is an awful mess. I'm the only one left. But this time, God answers. He tells Elijah that he has chosen a new king to replace Ahab. And make no mistake, this was groundbreaking. Not only was Israel going to have a new king, but this king was the first king since Jeroboam who was appointed by God. God is in control. Israel was going to go away from the anarchy it had known and move back to the theocracy with a king appointed by God. He would reverse the anarchy. He would destroy the family of Ahab and kill and erase the memory of Jezebel. And, says that still small voice, you're wrong about being the only one who's devoted to me in Israel. There are 7,000 faithful Israelites who have never bowed the knee to Baal. What is more, Elijah, I have found your successor. You have done a great job for me, but the journey is too great for you. It is time for you to receive your reward. For Elijah, the time for wind, earthquake, and fire had passed. It is time for peaceful stillness in the presence of God. And so it is with us. First, sure, there are times when we are engaged in battle for our Lord. We step out wearing the full armor of God and engage in battle for him. The wind and fire of the battle swirl around us as we take the shield of faith to furiously fend off the fiery arrows, flaming arrows. But then there are times of respite, times when we can spend time with our Lord, taking stock of where we are as God himself sees it. Our demeanor is no longer distorted by engagement with the enemy, but that still small voice brings us peace, rest, assurance, comfort, as we spend time simply knowing him.